You guys ready to jump into some scripture? Here we go. Grab some. So get some in front of you on your phone or good old hard copy. There's a copy of scripture there on the table if you didn't bring a copy of scripture with you. If you don't know this, I'm a pastor over in Winter Park and have long connections here in Summit County. And so coming over here kind of in the in-between, helping Summit Church, helping you guys get to the next level and find the next pastor to lead you guys. But we really envision long-term connection between our two churches, Winter Park and over here in Dillon. And so I haven't preached like a real sermon in a while. We've been doing a video series, Francis Chan's Basic Series. And so back to kind of what I would call a real sermon tonight. And so I'm pumped. This is from a series we just finished over in Winter Park. And we spent the last 6 weeks really digging into the life of David and looking specifically for the gospel in the life of David from the Old Testament. And so that's why the slide says what it does, the gospel according to David. And we just spent time hitting the highlights. And tonight, I'm going to cover with you guys what is likely David's lowest point in his life. And if you grew up in church, you know what's coming, you know what that is. And for some of our folks over in Winter Park, when we preached through this section of Scripture, David's lowest point, likely lowest point of his life, there were some there that had never heard this. Their eyes had never fallen across these Scriptures. And so maybe that's the case here tonight too. I don't know each of you and all your background, but here's what we said. This is important to know and remember that when we dig into the Old Testament, our tendency is to read the Old Testament as if they're just a collection of like moral stories or stories that we're just supposed to read and then take some kind of life lesson and apply it and then hopefully have a better life. That's how we, if we're not careful, how we typically read the Old Testament, as if it's just Aesop's fables kind of stuff. For instance, we could, we're not going to tonight, obviously, but we could look at the story of David and Goliath, and we could read that, and we could read through there and go, okay, well, what's the moral life lesson? Well, the moral life lesson is pride comes before the fall, or the bigger they are, the harder they fall, and now I'm going to apply that to my life, and maybe somehow my life will be better. Guys, that way of reading the Old Testament falls so short of what was intended. There's so much more going on than just some moral stories. You guys can jot this down. We won't go there tonight, but Luke 24, there's this incredible account. It's Jesus after he has resurrected. And he's walking on the road to Emmaus, and a couple of his followers are there, and Jesus is kind of incognito. He's kind of in disguise. He's not allowing them to know who he is. And so he's walking beside them, and they are talking about what just happened to Jesus, that he was crucified, that he was buried, and they're trying to make sense of all of this. And Jesus, I just wish I could be there as a fourth kind of member of their party, watching this unfold, knowing what we know. Because as they're walking along, Jesus begins to tell them about the Old Testament, Moses and the prophets. It says he begins to tell them about that, and then he begins to say that all of that is about himself. That all of that stuff in the Old Testament is about Jesus himself, and that gives us great insight as to how we should interpret the Old Testament. So much more than just moral stories. These stories are pointing to Jesus. Scholars call Jesus the scarlet thread that runs throughout Scripture. Not just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the scarlet thread that runs throughout Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament. So while we can't take liberties in the Old Testament and look at every little word and say, oh, well, every little word here is about Jesus. Not to that extent, but what we can do is read the Old Testament with eyes to see Jesus, eyes that are actively looking for Jesus, eyes that are looking to see the gospel shine through the pages of the Old Testament. And when you start to read the Old Testament that way, stuff just springs alive off the page, stuff you never saw before when you read the Old Testament through the lens of the gospel. And so with that in mind, give you a little bit of background without having gone through the whole series with you guys. When we see the life of David in the Old Testament, what we see is a lot of foreshadowing of the Christ to come in David's life. We see a lot of foreshadowing of Jesus who would come. And some of it is comparison, the way that David is like Jesus who will come. And then some of it is contrast. And tonight is going to be contrast against David, the King David, and then Jesus, King Jesus to come. And so a lot of contrast. So let's start in 1 Samuel 8 tonight. And a little bit of background here. Israel, God's chosen people, they've decided that they want an earthly king to rule them instead of God. So this is what's going on. We always want to read in context. This is what's going on. They want an earthly king to rule them instead of being led by God himself. And God will end up letting them have an earthly king, but there will be a warning from Samuel, the prophet to Israel, about what having an earthly king will be like. And so I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'm going to have you guys read a little bit with some people around you as well. We do that regularly here, lots of interaction, lots of kind of talking around the table and back and forth. So this is 1 Samuel 8. Let me get there. That'd be helpful if I was there. 1 Samuel 8, we're going to start in verse 4, and I'm going to read a few verses, and then I'll let you guys read some. And so here, starting in verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old," which just found that as funny, right? More and more, as I get older, I feel like there's always a chance someone can come up to me and say, "Behold, you are old." And I'll just take it. I'll absorb it, right? I'll say, "You're right. And your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods." Remember that part. "So they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of a king who shall reign over them." And so now, coming next is the warning that Samuel's going to give God's people as to what having a king will be like. And this is the part I want you to read with people around you. I want you to read verses 10 down through 19. And I want you to listen for a word that's repeated. Big hint, starts with a T, and you'll see it repeated over and over again as to what having an earthly king is going to be like. And so you guys read that out loud. Someone around you will read that out loud. You guys follow along with them and listen for that word repeated. I'll just give you a minute or two to do this. It won't take very long to work down through. In fact, just go to verse 18. Read through verse 18. I'll do 19. Ready, go. Okay, you guys are probably just about down to the bottom of that, at least down far enough to hear the repeated word. What was it? Take, right? Yeah, as you guys read down through there, it's pretty obvious. Samuel's warning, you want an earthly king? Here's what it's going to be like. He's going to take from you. And then verse 19, this is such a dark verse when you think about it. And we're going to come back to this idea. But verse 19, this is how God's people respond to the warning from Samuel. But the people, what? What does it say? Refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us." Remember that. Remember that. Hang on to that. Earthly king will take. That's the background work we needed in order to get to where we're going tonight. And so now jump to 2 Samuel chapter 11. It'll be the bulk of where we spend time tonight. We're going to go down here just verse by verse until we get to a different chunk here. There is no way we could do justice to this entire section of the narrative. And so as always, go home, read what we don't read. Read 11, the rest of 11, and especially 12. 12 is going to be so key. And so here's, for me, in knowing what we know about David, there's so many stories about David's heroic, so many heroic events in David's life that we know about. We see him as triumphant and victorious. And this was hard to read in preparing for this particular sermon. I'd heard this before growing up in church. I'd read this and heard sermons on this, but for me, reading David's fall, what he's going to struggle with and how he's going to struggle was really hard to read as I prepared. Likely the lowest moment of his life. Let's dig in here. Verse 1 of 2 Samuel chapter 11. It goes like this. In the spring of the year, the time when what? Yeah, when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David did what? He remained. He remained in Jerusalem. And if you've heard any kind of sermon on this passage, you know this is a big deal, that the author wants us to know that David remained in Jerusalem. He remained right there when it's clear the author wanted us to know he shouldn't have been there in the first place. He should have been off fighting the battle with his soldiers, with Joab, the commander. He should have been out, but instead he was back at home in the palace. And where the author doesn't really tell us why, whether he had a little bit of an upset stomach, whether he was feeling under the weather, whether he had had lots of victories up to this point. Maybe he was getting a little comfortable at this point. Maybe he was kind of like, well, man, I've fought hard, I've worked hard. I think I'm going to sit this one out. I've kind of earned a break. We don't really know, but it's important to see that this decision to stay back when he should have been out fighting is going to be a big deal. It's going to lead to other things down the road. That what's about to transpire as David's going to go downhill here, it was due to a series of decisions beforehand. And it's likely the same for us when we think about ways that we've failed in the past. It's rarely due to just one big bad decision. There were likely many decisions that may have seemed small and insignificant that led to a big kind of mistake decisions in our life. And if you're older than about 10 or 11, you can identify with that, of a way that you've completely screwed up in the past, and you can look back and kind of track it again, hindsight, and go, oh man, there were little decisions all along the way that I made that led to that bigger bad decision. Keep that in mind. Verse 2, let's keep reading here. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, or the palace, that he saw from the roof a what? Yeah, a woman bathing. And the woman was what? Yeah, very beautiful. This is David's moment of temptation, the moment when he could have made a different decision than what he's about to make. This is the crossroads here for David. When he saw this beautiful woman from his palace, and scholars, they're kind of split. Some say that maybe it was a sign of the way he was living his life, that he was sleeping in the middle of the day when he probably should have been up doing other things. Other scholars say, well, it was pretty common in the cool. As the afternoon was hot, you would go in and kind of do the siesta thing. We don't really know, and that we're not really given a lot of details. But we know that he got up from his couch, walking around on the roof, and he sees this woman bathing. And in that moment, there's a crossroads for him. He could have, in that moment, right, he could have gone, beautiful woman, not mine, right? He could have said, beautiful woman, not mine. Man, I need to go walk on the other side of the palace roof where I can't see her. Maybe I need to go off the roof and go down and take a cold shower. Any of those decisions would have been different, right, than what he's about to stumble into. And maybe we shouldn't say stumble into, what he's about to run headlong into. He gives in to his curiosity and his lust. And so verse 3, let's see what happens next. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And so up to this point, just a little side note here, we've seen her called woman now for the third time. Woman, woman, woman. We'll get to that, some speculation as to why that is. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" I don't know who this guy is. It could have been a woman as well. We don't know. I don't know who this person is that gives David the identity of this woman. But there's a contrast going on here. See, David is saying the woman, the woman, the woman. And I think what the author wants us to see is the way that David is viewing Bathsheba just as a body, not an identity, not a woman with a soul. The woman, the woman, the woman. And then this servant steps up, and I think he's trying to tell David in a very wise way, David, this is not just a woman. This is not just a body. This is someone's daughter. This is someone's wife, and she has a name, David. It's Bathsheba. It's not just some woman or some body that you're lusting after. Interesting, the contrast that's going on there. What a wise servant. And again, in contrast with David's full-blown objectification of Bathsheba. She's not a daughter or a wife. She's simply a body to him at this point. So verses 4 and 5, as we read this part, remember what Samuel said an earthly king would do. What was the word? Take. Remember that Samuel said this was going to happen. An earthly king would take. And so remember that as we read verses 4 and 5 here. So David sent messengers and what? Took her, right? Sent messengers and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. And what the author is trying to tell us there is that she just had her period, and she is going through the purification ritual. And so the author wants us to know there's no way she could be pregnant right now. And so that's what's going on. That's why that little detail is in there. Not that she may have slept with someone the night before and the baby is someone else's. And so this says, then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David what? What did she say? I am pregnant. Those are the words that she sent to David. Some scholars at this point will point to Bathsheba's part in all of this. And I believe this is mostly, and you've heard it in sermons as well, if you've grown up in the church, they'll point at this point kind of in the sermon or in the article or in the commentary, they'll make sure that we know that likely it's just as much Bathsheba's fault as David's. And likely that's to minimize David's sin, as if to say, well, yeah, David messed up, but this lady was doing this, or this lady did that. And we have to be careful here that we're not putting blame on Bathsheba that doesn't belong. Now, does she have guilt in this? Likely so. But it's clear here, we don't get anything of the way Bathsheba feels. We don't get much detail at all about her other than she came to him when David beckoned her. And so David requests her, the king, the most powerful guy in the land, requests that she come to the palace, and she comes to the palace. She likely does not know what's going on at this point when she came to him, and so we want to put that on there and say, well, she was being flirtatious, or she wanted David, or she was bathing on purpose where David could see her. That's all reading into the text. We don't know that. That's just all speculation here. And I would say what we're supposed to see here, the reason why we're not given a whole lot of details about Bathsheba is because we're supposed to be focusing on David and his failure. This is about David and his failure here. We're supposed to see David abusing his power and taking. And we have to ask, did Bathsheba even feel like she could say no? The most powerful guy in the land. You have to ask those questions. And aside from this speculation, again, that's speculation as well. What's clear is that this story is about David's failure, and that's why we're just not given a ton of info on Bathsheba. We're supposed to be moved by David's sin and failure as the king. Verses 6 and following, here's what's going to happen. We're going to move through this part pretty fast. And this is a part where you could go and read up a little on this and see that I'm not making this stuff up. This is how the story goes. David moves into the cover-up phase of his sin, right? David moves into the cover-up phase of his sin. He tries to get Uriah, who is, again, Bathsheba's husband. He's off fighting. He's one of David's mighty men. It's kind of like a Navy SEAL kind of the Israelite army, one of about 30-ish. The number fluctuates a little bit throughout the narrative, but between 30 and 40 of David's mighty men, he's one of those guys. And so David sends a message to have Uriah killed in battle. And so if this is all brand new to you, heavy drama going on here. And so David sends message that Uriah is supposed to be killed. But before that, the interesting thing is, and this is just, you talk about cover up. Before he has Uriah murdered, he brings him back from the battle. He says, they have some small talk, and he says, why don't you go back and wash your feet, which was a euphemism for sleep with your wife. The last thing you would do before you got into bed, wash your dirty feet. He says, go home and wash your feet. Have some fun. Enjoy your time away from the battle. And Uriah is pictured as more honorable than King David because he will not go and experience that pleasure at home with his wife when he says the ark of God and God's soldiers are out on the battlefield. How could I do that? I'm not going to do that. And so Uriah does not go home and sleep with his wife, and so that's why David has to send word to have Uriah killed. And so in this bizarre picture, Uriah is carrying this letter with the official seal of King David in his hand back to the battle, and inside this letter is essentially his death orders. And so you can go read the details. Uriah is killed in battle by David's order. And so David thinks the cover-up has worked. And David thinks that everything is going to be great. And so as we see David's progression here, what's happened, listen to these words. You can flip over there if you want to. You don't have to. It's James chapter 1. And when we lay James chapter 1 over what we see in 2 Samuel, the words are just chilling. Listen to what James says about the progression of sin. Verse 12 of chapter 1 of James. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. That could have been David. That could have been David in his moment of temptation. Verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. Verse 14, and as we read this, just think of what we've seen transpire with David. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So much going on here in 2 Samuel, and I would give us some questions to ponder here. If you're just jumping in with us or haven't been with us much, here we always go to the heart of things. We don't just look at the Word and try to download some knowledge. We go to the heart, the soul of things. And so here's some questions to ponder at a heart level. And if you're immediately defensive or dismissive, that might be cause for concern as you hear these three questions. What sin have you been trying to cover up or hide from others or from God? What sin have you been trying to cover up or hide from others or from God? Question 2. Are there areas in your life where you are beginning to compromise that are not yet full-blown like we see from David? And this is a question that really gets at the exit ramp, right? You may be tonight being offered an exit ramp from the path that you're on that will lead to that desire that gives birth to sin that then leads to death. Maybe that's your exit ramp tonight. Are there areas in your life where you are beginning to compromise that are not yet full-blown like we see from David? And then the third question, are there sinful behaviors or patterns of sin that you've been justifying instead of confessing? We're awesome at this. We are so good at this. When we find ourselves in patterns of sin or in moments of temptation, we are so incredibly great at just justifying them. Well, I deserve this pleasure. I deserve this because I've had a hard week at work, or I deserve to walk over here because of what I've walked in the past. We justify instead of confess. Well, let's see what happens here. Look at verses 25, 26, and 27 in 2 Samuel 11, right where we were. We're just going to skip down a little bit. Verse 25, here's what's going to happen. The messenger will come back from the battle to tell David that Uriah has been killed. And so the messenger's bringing David word back, and then David is going to respond to that messenger that's telling him that Uriah has been killed. And listen to how dismissive David is in this. And so verse 25, here's what it says. David said to the messenger, again, who has just brought word that Uriah has indeed been killed. There's what David says. Thus shall you say to Joab, don't let this matter, what? Displease or upset you. Don't let this matter displease you. For the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it and encourage him. Verse 26, and when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. Here's evidence that Bathsheba wasn't somehow unhappy in her marriage and she was looking to get with David. If that was the case, the author may tell us something like she was glad that her husband was dead, so now she could be with David. That's not what we see. She lamented over her husband. Verse 27, and when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. And this last sentence here is just crazy. Listen to this last sentence. Again, in light of what David said, hey, don't let this matter about Uriah being killed displease you. Here's what the author says. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. That's like, wow, the contrast that's going on there is incredible. What David had done displeased the Lord. David bowed down to his lust. He took from multiple people, and the effects were devastating to him, to his family, to the people of God, the Israelites that he was leading. You can read about it. The many negative consequences are going to come about because of his sin. Well, David will eventually confess his sin and turn back to the Lord. In chapter 12, there's a young prophet named Nathan that comes to David and tells David the story about this man that took something that did not belong to him, and David is outraged at the story. And he says, man, this guy should be put to death, whoever this guy is, and he should pay back 4 times of what he took before he's put to death. And then Nathan has this sentence, if any of you remember what it is, he says, you are that man, David. You are that man. And that's when David confesses, and God will forgive David. You can go back and read and do some homework later at home. But I want to take this to a place I'd never really thought of before when I'd read or studied this passage. Maybe we identify not just with David tonight, because all of us on some level can identify with David. Again, if you're older than about 10 or 11, you can read that and go, yeah, I've been there. I've walked down that road. I've seen my desire and lust lead to sin, which has led to death. I've seen that in my life. But maybe we don't just identify with David, but maybe the Israelites as well. maybe we can identify with God's people as well. Remember, they wanted an earthly king instead of God, and God told them that an earthly king would take from them. And I just wonder if we can let our walls down for a minute. If we've maybe in some ways, like the Israelites, rejected God's reign and rule in our lives, and now we're bowing down to someone or something of this world. I'm going to ask it again just so we're hearing this clearly. Like the Israelites, maybe we can look at our lives and go, yeah, I have rejected God's reign and rule and am now bowing down to someone or something of this world. And we can regularly read down through a list, and this is not exhaustive, but some of us have made our career our God, either in the past or right now. Some of us have made an earthly relationship our God, either in the past or right now, right? Some of us have made a substance our God. So easy to let weed wrap around you up here, or alcohol wrap around you, and that becomes your God. Some of us have made food our God. Some of us have made our kids our God. If you have kids, you know the temptation that's there to make your kids your God. I've got 3 of them, and it's so easy to make your kids your God. They make terrible gods, by the way. If you're a parent, you know that. But there's a temptation to make your kids your God. That's what you live for. That's where you put all your resources. And we wouldn't say it like this, but we worship our kids, our family. Some of us have made religion our God, and this is a big one if you grew up in the church. Now, you made your God just trying to do the right things in life, morality, thinking that would get you somewhere. Let me say this, there's something these earthly kings are great at. All those earthly kings we just listed, there's something they're great at. They're great at taking from us. They're great at taking from us. And we fall headlong and start worshiping the gods of this world as if it's going to make us our life better, as if it's going to get us somewhere, and they only end up taking from us. And again, if you've lived any kind of life at all, you know at the core, that's true, that the things of this world eventually just take from us. And so I said it like this last Sunday, and this was really poignant to me. If you like being taken advantage of, if you like being beat down, if you like feeling empty, if you like having life taken from you, then just find something of this world and start bowing down to it, and that's what'll happen. And again, if you're older than 10 or 11, chances are you can look back at a point in your life and go, yeah, I've lived that, and yet I've fallen into the same pit right now. I've forgotten that that's how things work. That's what earthly kings do. They take from us. By God's grace, may we see the truth in this tonight. By His Spirit, may the enemy's lies be brought into the light tonight. And I want to read this passage over us. It's real short. It's from John chapter 10. Jesus said this, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy." And Jesus said, "But I have come that you may have" what? Life, right? Life, abundant life. Church, this is where we can see an incredible contrast between David and Jesus. David, an earthly king, would be guilty of taking, but our King Jesus, God in the flesh, would give and give and give, even to the point of death on a cross. Through Jesus, God would offer us grace upon grace, mercy upon mercy, that when we confess our sin before him, Scripture says He is faithful and just to forgive us our sin and cleanse us of all unrighteousness. I would ask, isn't that incredible stuff? Like, doesn't that fall? If you have ears to hear, in that message, there's something incredible about that. We have a perfect King who by His death offers us forgiveness, and by His resurrection gives us life. And I would ask, does that good news, does that gospel fall on a soft heart, a soft, teachable heart, or does it fall on a hard heart? Because it does one or the other tonight. That message, that gospel of His mercy and grace Does it fall on a soft heart or a hard heart? We're going to get to close out in song and have time to reflect on that. I think some of us, the way the word falls on us, we've had soft hearts and are ready to hear and are responsive to him to say, yeah, I needed this exit ramp tonight because of the road I've been walking on. And God, by your grace, by your mercy, by the power of your Spirit, I want to step off onto the exit ramp. And before things get full blown like we saw from David, and maybe some of us are freshly moved by King Jesus that gives and gives and gives in the contrast of the things of this world that take and take and take. And I don't know where you are spiritually. I think some of us tonight, even just in a small group like this, could be in the place where we're like, man, that's so true. This thing over here that I've been bowing down to, ultimately it's been taken from me. It's been robbing from me where I thought it was given life. So I don't know where the word hits you tonight, but may we all be soft and before him and ready to receive whatever it is that he has for us tonight. So we're going to go into a time of prayer. I'm going to lead us in one more song. And as always, whatever kind of posture is best for you guys. If you want to sit, if you want to stand, if you want to get on your knees, lights will be down. You can go back in the back and just get on your knees if you want. That's not weird here. So feel free to do that as well. But let's go to him in prayer.